today we're covering 5 considerations when switching HR software in 2022. Um, Joel mentioned the Q&A. We do have a Q&A portion at the end. I do try to cover a lot of ground in these webinars. I try to make them as valuable as possible. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, cover a lot of topics. If you do have questions along the way, though, put them into that Q&A widget, and Joel will interrupt me along the way if there's a question you want to have right, or a discussion you want to have right then. But if not, we'll cover them at the end in the Q&A. So I want to give it just a minute overview on Newcastle Research. Not as a sales pitch, but whenever I sit in on a webinar, particularly when someone's giving recommendations, I always like to understand who the presenter is, what they do, so I can understand, where did these recommendations come from? In short, like, why should I listen to this person? So consider this the why should I listen to this person portion of the webinar. In short, we do a number of things at Newcastle Research. We're a independent research and advisory firm focused on the human capital management space. We do a number of things within that bucket, but the primary thing we do is we help customers choose the best HR solution for their needs, right? So two different kinds of customers that we typically work with. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but customers are typically, if they make their way to us, it means they're not happy with what they're using today. Typically, I do welcome people calling up and saying, hey, I love this system. I love this system. Love to hear it. But typically people find their way to my desk because they are unhappy with what they're doing today and they need some help, right? And so sometimes they're coming off of paper, Excel spreadsheets, right? They don't have a formal system today and they're looking to modernize and get on a system. And sometimes they're on a formal human capital management system today and they just don't like it, right? They went through a selection process a couple of years ago, whatever it is, and it's just not working for them, and they don't want to make the same mistake again, right? I call him intern Timmy. Raises his hand at some point in the selection process and says, "Hey, we did this 2 years ago, and we're unhappy. Like, why are we doing the same thing? Let's get some help." So that's what we do. Typically, what that looks like is we help create a short list of options that make sense for the company. So we'll go in, dive into what your requirements are, must-haves, nice-to-haves, what you're using today, what you're trying to accomplish, where your pain points are. So that's some background, just so you understand where these recommendations come from, right? Because we have formal engagements with customers, and in addition to that, we do a lot of webinars like this, and I always welcome people to follow up afterwards. If you have any questions that didn't get answered, if you want to dive deeper into any particular topic, as I said, I do try to cover a lot of ground to make it as valuable as possible for a wide range of people. So we could go deeper into any topic, and if you want to do that, I welcome the conversation. So we have a lot of conversations throughout the year that aren't formal engagements. So we get a lot of visibility into who people like, why they like them, what their pain points are, what they're looking, what questions they're asking. And so that's where a lot of the content came today. So our focus is on understanding the market, right? Think of this as a illustrative representative set of HCM vendors out in the market. This is by no means a comprehensive, a complete list. There are literally hundreds of options out there in the market, but this is just to give you a flavor of this is who we sit with. This is who we try to understand. We regularly go to these folks' conferences. We sit in on demos. So we're experts on these systems, right? But that's only half of the battle, right? So our focus is on understanding the market, but it's also understanding the customer, right? And so who I mean by customer, obviously customers who work formally with us to help them with their search, we need to understand their needs. But on this slide, who I'm talking about is understanding the customer in general, right? And I already covered a little bit of this on the last slide, but the quickest, simplest, cleanest way to illustrate, understanding the customer is you might have two customers at some HCM vendors user conference, right? And they might look really similar on paper, right? They might be in the same industry. They might be relatively the same size, right? In terms of employee count, they might be in the same geographies, right? So they might be just within the Northeast or the Southeast or West of the US, and they're not international, whatever. On paper, they look very similar. But one of these customers might hate the vendor they're working with, and one of them might love them, right? And so in a nutshell, that's our job, is to understand, how does that happen, right? Where did that one fail? Where did this one succeed? And really peeling back the covers. And oftentimes, if you have enough of those conversations, you start to realize that a lot of it is the questions that they asked along the way to get to their decision, right? So on paper, it's very easy to say, well, this competitor over here, or this partner we have over here, this entity over here, this other company that looks a lot like us, they use HCM vendor XYZ. We should use HCM vendor XYZ because they're happy, we'll be happy. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You really need to tailor the solution to your needs. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do. So what we're covering today, Joel mentioned this at the top, 5 considerations when switching HR software in 2022. I actually snuck a 6th one in there. So that little update on the slide. 6 considerations when switching HR software. 5 considerations has a better ring to it, in the title. But I added this one recently. So that's what we're going to do. So consideration number 1, what's the right HR technology vehicle for your needs? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on any one of these. As I said, we could spend an hour on any one of these considerations, but I'm going to cover a lot of ground. This one is, for most of you on the call, I'm assuming, and by vehicle, I mean HCM, PEO, HRO, quick definitions on those. And there are more, human capital management for the purposes of our webinar today. What I mean by that is a SaaS, software as a service system that you and your team use, to manage your HR, payroll, time and attendance, talent management needs, soup to nuts, right? Full life cycle management. PEO is a professional employer organization. It's a co-employment situation. HRO, a full outsourcing, right? So you're outsourcing your entire HR department at that point. And all of these are valid vehicles. And so, for illustrative purposes, I use car analogies a lot because everyone can relate to buying and driving a car. So we have a Tesla, we have a Ducati, a Range Rover, all great vehicles, and they have a lot in common, right? Too, they're all wheeled land vehicles, right? But they're designed to do very different things, right? And so if you are looking for a car and you're commuting 200 miles a day, Jeep Wrangler or Land Rover, probably not your best bet. Right? It's great if you're going camping, right? But not if you're commuting 200 miles a day. Similarly, motorcycle, I have a friend in San Francisco, and he has a motorcycle and a car, and he said if he had to sell one, he'd sell his car, right? Because he can't park anywhere. But he can park his bike. So different needs, different requirements. So the point here is to I don't see this situation a lot, but I see it enough where it's worth mentioning. If your search has come down to, because as I said, if someone comes across my desk conversationally, they'll sometimes they're already down the path of looking for someone, and sometimes they're feeling great. They're like, all right, we're narrowed it down to 3 things, right? And sometimes they've narrowed it down to 3 completely different vehicles, right? A human capital management, SaaS system, a PEO, and HRO. I'm like, that's great. It's great to explore these things, and that's one point I want to leave you with. There's nothing wrong with any of those vehicles, right? It's the trouble you get into is when you narrow, if your final decision is still between 3 different completely types of vehicles, then your search didn't reflect your needs, right? And you haven't appropriately, compared like entities, right? And so what I always recommend is decide on a type of vehicle that best fits your needs, and then evaluate options within that category, right? So if an HCM system is the right mix for you, then your final decision shouldn't have a PEO player in there. Conversely, if the best vehicle for you is a PEO, then your final decision should have 3 different PEOs, right? So, and again, that's as much time I'm going to spend on it, but it's worth mentioning. The rest of the presentation is squarely focused on the SaaS human capital management systems, because I think that's probably what 95% of you on the call came here to listen to. Which brings us to our first poll. Joel mentioned we're going to have a few polls here. This is for 2 different reasons. I think it's kind of fun to make the webinar interactive a bit, but there's also a real function behind it. It helps me understand who's on the call, and to the extent I can, I will tailor the talk to who's on the call. So this gives me visibility into who's on, and I also think it's fun for people in attendance to see, what are other people experiencing, right? Other people in similar positions, similar HR, CFO, HR, payroll management, talent management. What are other people struggling with? What are they thinking about? So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out, and we can talk about the results. Okay, biggest pain point today with your current HCM system: missing functionality. Looks like it's taken the lead. I'll give you a few more seconds. It looks like people are still filling it out. I'm just writing some of these down. All right, great. Thanks a lot for filling those out. So that helps. It helps, as I said, it's interesting for people to see what other people are struggling with, but it also helps me understand who's on the call. So to the extent I can, I can tailor the talk to you. All right, thanks, Ben. Ben is our behind the scenes tech guy. He's the one that's running running those polls. So consideration number 2 is the solution a single HCM or an integrated HCM? So as I said, any one of these topics we could probably spend an hour on, and this one in particular you can go pretty deep on. So I'll give you a high level overview. Just first, kind of definition. What's the difference? A single, because and this is actually a good public service announcement. Definitions vary from HCM vendor to HCM vendor, right? Their marketing material and their talk tracks, what people are told, what customers, prospects are told. Their marketing message is going to line up with what they're selling, right? And so a single HCM is built from the ground up on a single code base, right? So it's one employee record in your single database. You hear multi-tenant architecture, all those things, but essentially at its core, it's built as a single system on one code base, one database, right? And integrated HCM are applications, for example, payroll, HR, time and attendance, or workforce management, talent management. Within talent management, you can have onboarding, recruiting, performance management, succession planning, compensation, learning, all those things. So in integrated HCM, you might have payroll and HR on one code base, one database, one system, and time and attendance, workforce management on another, and then talent management on a third. That's a common example. And they might be owned by the same company, right? So just because they're owned by the same company and they're coming to you, HCM vendor XYZ, just because they own all the modules doesn't mean it's a single HCM, right? So they could be partnering for some of those, and that's very common. One of the largest out there, and I'm very careful not to mention any names on webinars like this, public. I'm happy to mention names kind of off of a 1 to 400 audience. So give me a call if you want to talk about specific HCM vendors. But one of the largest ones out there, one of the most common things that they do for time and attendance, they partner with a third party, and that's very, very common. But why does it matter? Well, actually, let me finish on the integrated HCM. What's the difference? Just because one vendor is coming to you, even if it's not through a third party, the partnering, they could have acquired that module last year, right? And so it's kind of stitched together behind the scenes. It wasn't built from the ground up on a single code base. So why do you care, right? So a single HCM, and again, I'll go back to a car analogy. I live in New England, and so it snows here a lot in the winter, and so all-wheel drive is pretty close to a must-have for me. There are no real must-haves. I've had a two-wheel drive car. There are many two-wheel drive cars on the road, but all-wheel drive is pretty close to a must-have because it's, because of all the things that go with it in New England, right? So whenever I talk to clients, I talk to clients about, and customers who just follow up and aren't formal clients, but just want to chat, talk about must-haves and nice-to-haves, right? Because that's part of the process and understanding, how to whittle down the sea of options out there into just a few that really make sense to look deeper into. So you need to understand, what are your must-haves, what are your nice-to-haves? If single HCM is very close to a must-have for me. Again, as I said, there really are no true must-haves. It really depends on your requirements, but just because of the ripple effect. I know from talking to customers day in, day out, and I'll give you a perfect example. A common complaint of where their pain point is today is customer service, right? And so I'll get calls, and this gets to the ripple effect of the single HCM, right? How important that is, and a lot of customers don't realize the ripple effect. And so a lot of conversations I have with customers, organizations are educating, not just helping them find solutions, but kind of understanding why are you in pain today, right? So, but back to the example, a common one is customer service, right? So sometimes customer service is just that's both the symptom and the disease, right? They're just bad at customer service, right? But oftentimes a HCM vendor, they're trying their best with customer service, but it's the understanding behind the scenes that is lacking. So, for example, this is where kind of the ripple effect of a single HCM versus an integrated HCM can rear its ugly head. Common complaint is, well, customer service. We call them for HR and payroll questions, and they're great. They know everything off the top of their head. Like they can walk us through it. They know the system inside out, right? But if we have a question on time and attendance, it's complete. It's night and day, right? Or if we have a question on the recruiting module or the talent management module, it's just not the same, right? And so their customer service is really terrible. We want to improve customer service. And say, okay, that's a good goal. You do want to improve customer service because that's kind of one of those tough to quantify things that are really, really important to the relationship. And we'll cover that later. But a lot of times the customer I'm talking to, I say, okay, well, the reason they're not good at customer service, when you call about that specific functionality is because they partner for that functionality. And a lot of times the customer is like, I have no idea they partner for that. Like they never told us that. And I'm like, no, why would they? Right. Some, I shouldn't say why would they. A lot of account executives, most account executives, by account executives, I mean, salespeople, most people are very upfront, very, very transparent, very, very honest, but sometimes they'll hide the fact that they partner with something because they think it's something you don't want to hear. Right. Or they just acquired that module, last year, or, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 9 months ago. And so they're not as up to speed on it. And so sometimes what is the symptom is customer service, but the underlying problem is the architecture, right? It's not a single system, right? So that single system, this gets to the heart of why does it matter? There's a lot of what I would say kind of, more obvious ones, like no need to manually enter into separate databases, right? A single system requires a single update, right? There are security ramifications. There are reporting, for example, like if you want to run a report that involves time and attendance and HR and payroll, if those live in 3 different databases, that can sometimes be difficult. Sometimes you have to have another system laying on top of that, like an ambient Cognos system, for example. So reporting can be more difficult, less intuitive, less drag and drop, right? But it also extends to things like customer service, right? Which is not always intuitive for customers. But so if you can get it, a single HCM should be really at the top of your list. And be careful whenever you ask about a single HCM. A lot of times, if they don't have a single HCM, they'll say, "Oh, so I've had customers come back to me and tell me that they're like, "Oh, I asked, does it have a single HCM?" And the sales executive said, "Oh, it's completely integrated," right? So the way they answered the question makes it seem like they just answered your question in the positive, but they didn't, right? So you got to really dive deep. I had a customer call me back a couple months ago. And she said, once I started asking about single databases and multi-tenant architecture, so she called to thank me for the kind of coaching, because she said the sales executive that she was speaking with completely took a different tack. It was it was the sales executive realized that, okay, this person, I can't fool them, right? And so then she started to get the customer I worked with started to get more honest answers, right? And so you got to be careful about the marketing. You got to dive a little deeper, but yeah, so that's pretty close to a must-have. Consideration number 3, reselling scenarios. This is a good segue into reselling scenarios. I just want to keep an eye on the time. Reselling scenarios can be beneficial or detrimental. And so these are 2 situations you want to avoid. The first one, and by reselling scenarios, I'm referring to when one entity resells a product module that was developed and is owned by another entity, right? And so the example I gave, you're working with human capital management company XYZ for HR payroll, and they partner with someone else for time and attendance or for talent management. So they're reselling that solution, right? So one situation you want to avoid is that customer buys a solution, from a single provider and assumes it's a single system, right? The reality is it's a core component is delivered through third party. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on this because we covered a lot of that on the last slide. The result, separate database solution, multi-database solution. It's not a single solution. It's not a single HCM. It's an integrated HCM. And the result is the customer can experience disconnected workflow, disconnected user experience. And as I said, the support for that one module isn't as good as the other modules. So the ripple effect extends to customer service. So we covered a lot of this in the last slide, so I'm not gonna dive too deep into that one. But situation number two, and so the reason it can be the reason I call out two situations that you want to avoid, because the easy solution to that is just to avoid all reseller situations, right? One, that's going to dramatically reduce your options, but two, you don't want to do that. Because the situation number two that you want to avoid is customer says doesn't include any resellers in the search, right? They say, why would I buy from a reseller when I could buy directly from a software developer? And the result is you can eliminate from consideration what might be a better option, right? And so it comes as a surprise to some customers that I talk to, but there are situations when I actually recommend a reseller over the company that actually wrote the code that owns the product. In that situation comes up, more often than you might think. It comes to customer service, right? So when they are reselling, and actually I'll get to the next slide because this is kind of the prescriptive. Some of these slides, they're one consideration, but they trickle on to multiple slides because it's more of an in-depth topic. The key questions to ask to maximize your chance of success, because as I said, they can be detrimental, and that's when you get into that multi-database solution. The ones that can actually be beneficial is if the company is reselling an entire solution, right? So if the reseller is coupling another single database, unified single HCM solution with really great industry-leading, industry expertise or customer service or both, it can actually be better. And so there are times when I will recommend a reseller because they have better customer service and you're getting the same product. You're getting better, industry expertise, and you're getting the same product. So here are some questions to ask. What is being resold, right? If it's a complete solution, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? And that goes back to the single database, integrated single solution versus integrated solution, right? If it's a single solution that happens to be resold by a third party, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's one or two modules to round out a core offering, and this is the top right of the table you're looking at here, that's proceed with caution, right? Because that is a multi-database solution. And we covered that a couple of slides ago. There's a host of problems that can come with that, right? So number two, what is the underlying technology, right? Is it a single HCM or is it integrated? And you might look at one and two and be like, well, Patrick, that's the same thing. Sometimes a provider will sell a complete solution by a third party, but that complete solution is a multi-database offering. So I actually have to separate those out. But that gets back to the architecture, right? If a third party is reselling an entire solution and that entire solution is a single HCM, not necessarily a bad thing, right? If it's integrated, for all the reasons we've covered, proceed with caution, right? Number three is kind of one of those not necessarily intuitive, not as easy to diagnose, but why is it being resold, right? So if it's a long-term strategy of both companies, not necessarily a bad thing, right? But if it's a stopgap, and what I mean by stopgap is HR payroll company XYZ, 2019, 2020, COVID hits, they don't have learning management. They don't have, something that they need to cater to a now remote workforce, right? So they go out and partner, they go out and acquire, but they say, but we're going to build our own, right? So this partnership is temporary, right? And so any customer signing up for that, they know they're gonna have the solution that might last for 3, 6, 9 months until the main party that they're partnering with or choosing to do business with develops their own. And so 3, 6, 9 months down the road, their entire workforce is going to have to relearn a new solution, right? And so it's important to understand is if it's a long-term partnership or if they're just using a partner just to kind of tread water until they build out their own solution, because that can get messy. Not for a couple of reasons. One, because your workforce, as I mentioned, has to relearn an entire new solution. But at that point, it's a brand new solution as well. So you're kind of the guinea pigs, right? So not necessarily not a deal breaker, but these are the type of things that you really got to kind of look at a second layer, if you will. So I think that brings us to our second poll question. What is your company using today for your HCM needs? Multiple vendors, a single vendor, homegrown system, or a PEO? So I'll give you 30 seconds or so to fill that one out. I didn't want to lead the witness, but I was going to say, I'm guessing based on the first results that the vast majority of you are going to be using multiple HCM vendors, right? Because the results from the first poll, missing functionality, not easy to use. Those are typical symptoms when you're using multiple systems. A single HCM vendor now that's taking the lead. Homegrown system. No one's using a homegrown system. As I guessed, only 4% of you are using a PEO. So as I said, most of these recommendations, considerations are assuming you're going to be looking at a SaaS HCM vendor, but not all. PEO. We're going to talk about customer service. We're going to talk about those things as well. And it's also important to understand that the architecture, the technology behind the PEO. So yeah, multiple HCM vendors, single HCM vendor. As I said, missing functionality and not easy to use. I suppose that can be, they are typical symptoms of multiple systems, but certainly they could be for a single system as well. So thanks everyone for taking the time to do that. That helps me, as I said, understand who I'm talking to. Okay, consideration number 4, what is the implementation plan? As I said, if somebody makes their way to me, the vast majority of the time, it means they're not happy, right? Very, very seldom will a company call me just to say, hey, I love this vendor. I just wanted to share. Welcome that conversation. We'd love to have it, but most of the time, people aren't happy if they make their way to my desk. And so as I said, part of helping customers get back to a place where they're happy is understanding what's wrong today, right? So what are the pain points today? What am I trying to help you fix, right? And so part of that is not just understanding what's wrong, but when did it go wrong, right? So when did this? Because at some point, the organization that I'm speaking with, they picked that HCM vendor, right? And so at some point, they were enthused about it. They were happy about the prospect of working with this HCM partner, right? And so when did that go wrong? Why did it go wrong? And so that's important for me to not just help them, but important for me to understand so I can help other customers as well. Oftentimes I'll get visibility into what's going wrong with an HCM vendor before the HCM vendor even understands it, because customers are pretty vocal, with the HCM vendor that they're working with. But at a certain point, if they're not happy, they give up and they've made the decision to go somewhere else. And oftentimes the HCM vendor is the last to know, right? So they'll go find another option. They'll talk to me before they let the current vendor know that, hey, by the way, we're leaving, right? So it's interesting. I often get visibility. I see trends, before often the HCM vendors do. But long story short, the implementation plan is so important because oftentimes, I would say most often, the relationships started to sour before the system was even up and running live, right? The relationship starts to sour a lot of times during the implementation phase, right? In a lot of customers, and sometimes it's 50-50, right? Sometimes that is the HCM vendor's fault. They didn't have a good plan. They didn't accurately or appropriately convey that plan. And sometimes it's the customer's fault. And to be honest, sometimes they underestimate the importance of that implementation. They underestimate how much work it's going to take for the customer, not just the vendor. And it's not their fault a lot of times. Sometimes it's meaning they couldn't have known if they're coming off paper and they've never done an implementation, they just don't know what to expect, right? So here are some things to watch out for. So the vendor should have a very detailed plan, right? So some vendors are hesitant to tell customers how much work it's going to take because their competitor might be saying, oh, it's easy, it's a flip of the switch, even though it's really not. And that sounds really great. That sounds very inviting. And so that can be a sales tactic. The vendors that I tend to steer my customers towards are the more honest and transparent ones that are going to be very upfront with people about how much work it's going to take, right? This is our responsibility. This is your responsibility. This is how many hours you should expect to commit, your HR team, your payroll team. These are the milestones. So that's not often what customers want to hear, right? Because they're miserable. It's really tough to find a new vendor that they're enthused about, that decision process, right? That evaluation process that's taking them out of their day-to-day. Because and I get it, I talk to HR professionals day in, day out, right? It's what I do. And so I really do understand your pain, because I hear it all day. And I understand if you're using a system today, or if you don't have a system and you're being overworked with your paper-based process, Excel, spreadsheets, and so forth, you're being overworked today, right? So to ask you to go find a new solution, to conduct a search and evaluation, and sit through demos, and go through all the the dozens and hundreds of options out there. That's a lot. That's what I do. Believe me, I know that's a full-time job, right? And so you're already overworked, and then you're being asked to do more work, to do a search on top of the work that you're already trying to do. And so oftentimes, when customers get to that decision, they've made a decision, then they're like, whew, work's done, right? And so then they're looking forward to having it up and running. And I always have to caution customers, no, you're halfway there, right? You have to keep your eye on the prize. You got to really put some work in to make sure that this implementation is successful. So the HCM vendors that I like tend to be very transparent about that. What's your responsibility? What's my responsibility? That type of thing. What to watch out for if the vendor is, as I said, sometimes it's the customer's lack of experience, lack of knowledge in the process. They underestimate the amount of work it's going to take to have a successful implementation. But sometimes it's the vendor's fault, right? They have they've oversold the ease. They have undersold the amount of work that it takes, right? And so if they don't have a good plan, they don't have an organized plan. If they don't know how to structure that, then they're often largely to blame, right? And a lot of vendors, as I said, a lot of sales people within, well, as I said, most are good. I use car analogies a lot, and I'll stick with that. You're getting on the highway, and most people aren't cutting you off, right? Most people aren't driving like maniacs. Most people are not jerks, right? But some are, right? And so similarly, there are some sales executives who will just tell you whatever you want to hear, right? To get you to the finish line, to get you to sign on the dotted line. And so sometimes you will get a sales executive saying like, oh, we'll figure it out when we get there. We do this all the time. Don't worry. It's going to be a piece of cake, right? If you get any kind of vague answer to, what is the implementation plan? What are the milestones? How many hours should we expect to commit? What are you going to do? What are we going to do? What are we responsible for? All that. If you get any kind of vague answer, proceed with caution, right? Because if the customer doesn't know what to expect during the implementation, it's a recipe for disaster. All right, consideration number 5. This is the one I snuck in because I've seen it a couple times recently, and I think it's important. I could probably do 10 recommendations. These are I think these ones give you the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. So I keep an eye on the time. Who needs to be involved in the customer side, right? And so get buy-in early across functional areas. And what I mean by that is oftentimes my point of contact with engagement is HR, Chief Human Resources Officer, Chief People Officer, SVP, directors, managers of HR and payroll. That's typically who I'm working most closely with. And the organizations who, it's all about maximizing your chance of success, right? And some of that is choosing the right solution, for your needs. Some of that is making sure that it's implemented correctly. But a significant component of that is getting buy-in and making sure that everyone's on board at your organization, right? And so I encounter this once in a while where HR will say, yeah, we really don't like this, and but IT wants this, and we're just going to do our search and then go around IT. Don't do that, right? You can't. I mean, it's as painful as it might be to, and I get that it's not always possible, but the vast majority of the time, you're going to be much better served getting everyone at the table. Finance, and these are the functional areas that I always recommend having a seat at the table. HR, obviously, payroll, benefits, talent management, executive sponsorship, right? Sometimes you might have that, built in. If the chief people officer, chief human resource officer, CFO, whatnot is on board. Finance, IT, and operations, right? Because if I've seen it, right? I've seen, as I said, sometimes companies, organizations, by the time they get to me, they're already kind of down the path in their search process. And sometimes they're like, yeah, whatever, IT just found out that we're doing this, and they're all upset. And so sometimes the role I play is kind of, moderator, mediator, trying to get everyone on board, which is helpful, by the way. That's not really what we hang our shingle out to do, but that's a helpful, that's a valuable service, indirect service that we provide. But to the extent you can get everyone on board early, you're going to be much better off. I just did a webinar fairly recently about how to win over finance, and so if you want to talk about that, give me a call. But I'll take a quick side road. I'll give you kind of the 2-minute version on that. A lot of times, HR knows they're in pain, right? They know the process isn't as smooth, is not as efficient as it could be. They know it's impacting, things like employee engagement. And sometimes they go to the CFO and they say, hey, we need a new system. And the CFO says, we have a system. Like, what's wrong with it? Quantify it for me. Like, why do you want to go spend X on a brand new system? And HR says, well, because we're unhappy. Like, we're miserable, right? And so I have a game plan. I have an organized way to structure that conversation with the CFO. It's an ROI based, argument, pitch, if you will. And so that's important. But so we can have a whole other conversation about that. I do webinars on just that as well. But I thought it was worth mentioning because it's really important to make sure that everyone gets on board. But the key message here is just get all the functional areas involved, get them involved early. They're not all going to have the same involvement in the whole process. Like the CFO is probably not going to sit in on every demo, and you don't need them to, right? But just make sure that all the different corners of the organization are aware and on board and support what's going on. Which brings us to our last poll question. What is the most important criteria in selecting your next HCM solution? I started talking last time before everyone had a chance, so I'm gonna keep my mouth shut this time. All right, looks like they're starting to settle in. So yeah, features, functionality. It's always interesting to see. Looks like they're still changing. I'll give the people a minute. It's always interesting to see how this, because I do polls. Most of the time I do polls if I have time. If the amount of ground that I'm trying to cover allows me to have polls, I think it's always valuable. But it's always interesting to see how this one lines up with the first poll, right? The first poll asks, why are you in pain? And this last poll asks, what are you looking for with your next one? And so always interesting to see how those match up, right? So missing functionality represented, I think my notes here are accurate, 50% of why people are in pain. So great, we're right around 50%. So that makes sense. What's interesting is, and I've never done a webinar where this has not come to pass. Customer service is always, in terms of what you're looking for your next solution, is always lower than why you're in pain. So meaning, why you're in pain, let's say 10%, 12%, 15%, 20%, say customer service. What you're looking for your next solution, it never fails that number is lower, and which is always a great segue for what we're going to talk about next. Thanks, Ben, for doing the polls. So consideration number 6, customer service. As I said, it's always a great segue because, as I said, never fails. It's typically, if not the number one reason, but one of the top reasons why customers leave their current HCM vendor. So you would think if it's at the top or even the top reason that you're leaving your last vendor, stands to reason it should probably be the number one reason or number one thing you're trying to evaluate. And it never fails, either in webinars, doing polls, or customers that I'm working with. As I said, one of the first things I do, whether it's just an informal conversation with a webinar follow-up with a conversation, or a customer that I'm working formally with, one of the first things I do is always ask, like, why are you in pain? Like, what's the problem? Like, what problem are we trying to solve? And oftentimes customer service is at the top. And then, a week goes by, a couple weeks go by, for the customers that I'm working with formally, and we get together their list of must-haves, nice-to-haves, and oftentimes customer service isn't even on the list. And it's always funny because I say, well, wait a minute, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, you said that was like your number one pain point. It's not even on your list. And then I just kind of let the crickets go, and then I let them off the hook, because the reality is it's a tough thing to quantify, right? And so it's a hard thing to quantify. Things like price, by definition, it's numbers that's relatively easy to quantify, right? It's just, our budget is X. Like, can we afford it or not? And even things like functionality, it's a checklist, right? As long as you have accurately captured what your needs are, right, you should be able to appropriately quantify that, right? We need it to do X. Can it do X? We need it to do Y. Can it do Y? Customer service, though, is a tough one, right? Because every single HCM vendor that you talk to is going to tell you that customer service is their top priority, right? So how do you differentiate between those, right? And they'll put CSAT metrics in front of you, like Net Promoter Score, CSAT, all these metrics. And I want to preface this by saying you shouldn't dismiss those metrics, but it's always important to understand what those metrics are, right? So somebody might, for example, put, and by somebody I mean an HCM vendor that you're evaluating, might put a CSAT score in front of you, like, oh, we have 95% customer satisfaction. That's great, right? And somebody else might have 93. Well, 94 is better than 93. Okay, great. But you got to dig a little deeper and understand what's behind those numbers, right? How many of your customer base, what percentage of your customer base filled out that survey, right? Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 40%, right? But it's not 100%. It's never 100%, right? And so really what that CSAT number is telling you is that, oh, well, 40% of our customers, or 95% of 40% of our customer base really likes us. Well, okay. So my question is, what about the other 60% that didn't fill out the survey, right? And I can tell you, because I live in this industry, and we do polls, we do surveys, and I work with customers all the time. I can tell you that 60% that didn't fill out the survey is biased toward unhappy, more so than the people who fill out the survey. Because a lot of times customers, if they're unhappy, they're not going to stick around to fill out a survey. They're just going to leave, right? And so the point I want to leave you with is those customer satisfaction numbers they put in front of you, they don't tell the whole story, because not everyone fills out those surveys, right? And so, well, what do you do, right? So what's the best way to measure customer service? And so this is one of the best considerations, one of the best recommendations I can give organizations looking around at different vendors. Judge them on customer retention, right? And intuitively, that makes sense, right? Customers vote with their dollars. Use a car analogy again. If your neighbor across the street is on their third Toyota Camry, or their fourth, Ford F-150, you don't need to ask them if they like Toyota Camrys or if they like Ford F-150s. They like them because they keep buying them, right? So that's, in a sense, it's intuitive, right? Customer retention. If customers like the vendor, the higher the percentage that is, the more efficient a vendor is at keeping their customers. Stands to reason that, the better they are at providing customer service. And I can tell you from years of doing this that the correlation between those two things is very, very high. And this is a great way to measure really any company that is selling something via a recurring revenue model, right? And so whether that's Netflix selling you movies, or a human capital management company selling you software and the service that goes with it, if it's a recurring revenue, if they want to get you to pay them forever, via subscription, then the best way to evaluate how well they do what they do is how good they are at keeping customers. And by the way, that model is not because people hear that, oh, paying me forever, and they're like, oh, I want to pay a company forever. Actually, you do, right? This is one of those cases where your goal as a customer is in line with the person selling you the software and the service, right? You want to be happy, they want you to be happy because they want you to stay forever, and you want to be happy forever, so you actually want to pay them forever, right? It's not a case of, the old story of, building a dishwasher or some appliance or refrigerator, right? At some point they figured out that, we don't actually want this refrigerator to last for 40 years, 50 years, 100 years, because then the customer is never going to buy another one from us, right? So in that case, the goal of the company is not really in line with the goal of the customer. The customer wants to buy this thing once and never have to buy another one again. But in this case, your goal and the HCM vendors' goals are in line. So judge them on that ability to keep customers. So the logical follow-up question, which is always the follow-up question I get, is, okay, so what's a good retention number? So this stoplight imagery is something I use a lot, and organizations that I work with tend to like it. The average for the HCM vendors that you're probably going to be looking at is typically, in terms of retention, is typically in that 90 to 94% range, right? And so below 90%, you need to look closer to understand what's going on, right? Because that's below average. Sometimes there is a reason for it, right? So for example, if the HCM vendor, if their target market is really, really small companies, then a lot of really, really small companies go out of business. And so their retention numbers are adversely impacted by that, right? So it's biased toward being lower just because a lot of their customer base goes out of business, right? Because most companies that go out of business, just statistically, numbers wise, are very, very small companies, right? So sometimes there is a reason for it, but it warrants further investigation if they're not keeping at least 90% of their customers year in, year out. Above 94%, you are in very rare territory. There are very few vendors who have retention numbers that high, and it's not an accident, right? And so some other considerations, kind of more definitions, customer retention versus revenue retention. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm treating them somewhat synonymously. They're not, right? Mathematically, the quick and dirty example that I always give, HCM vendor XYZ, they have 10 customers at the beginning of the year, right? One of those customers leaves. And so of the 10 that were there on, let's say their fiscal year is in line with the calendar year, of the 10 that were there on January 1st, 9 of them are still there on December 31st, right? So one left, that is 90% customer retention. Now, that one that left, if that was a really, really big customer of theirs and it represented 50% of their revenue, right? Although they have 90% customer retention, they only have 50% revenue retention. So the reason it's worth calling this out is because oftentimes a customer will ask for a customer retention number and the vendor will give them a revenue retention number just because that's how most of them track it. And that's fine, because as you get to hundreds and thousands of customers, those two numbers start to look a lot alike because you don't have any 1-2 customers representing 50% of the revenue. So don't be alarmed if you ask for customer retention, they give you revenue retention. Other kind of public service announcement, not all HCM providers disclose this. And for me, it's a caution flag if they don't, right? So what that most do, I would say probably two-thirds to 3/4 of HCM vendors will disclose this number to you. And a lot of them, if they're publicly traded, you can find it in their 10K. But the ones that don't, basically what they're telling you is, we don't want to tell you how good we are at the thing that we are trying to do. And that's a red flag for me. And I've had conversations with CFOs about this at companies, because I tell them, I say, hey, listen, this is a big thing that I talk to my customers about. And I had one, for those of you who have tuned into one of my webinars, I share this anecdote often because it's funny. Last year, I talked to a CFO and I said, why don't you disclose it? And he said, well, we're not publicly traded, so we're not required to. I said, I'm not required by law to brush my teeth, but I still do it, right? And so they didn't like that. But it gets to the point of that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to keep customers. They're not willing to disclose how good they are at keeping customers. They're not willing to disclose how effective they are at keeping customers happy and keeping them, that's a big red flag for me. And the last thing is definitions. Definitions will vary, right? And so there's one company in the last year who I actually had a couple of customers call me back and said, "Hey, you told us this was 92%. We just sat in on a demo and they said their number was 97%." I said, "Well, that's not accurate." And so I called their CFO and said, "What's going on?" He's like, I have no idea what that number is. Let me look into it." And so he called me back kind of sheepishly, a week later, and he said, "Oh, that 97%, our marketing department in their infinite wisdom decided that 97% is better than 92. And so what they did was they excluded things that they deemed beyond their control, like mergers and acquisitions, right? And so it wasn't a real number. It was a massaged number, if you will. And at the risk of sounding like an advertisement, it's going to be very difficult for organizations to suss that out on their own, right? You're going to need to pour through 10Ks. But if not me, then call somebody like me who is really, really well versed in this industry to help you weed through what is real and what is not. Because you can't, unfortunately, I wish every company out there was really transparent and straightforward and honest. But that's just not the case, right? So you got to be very careful about how they're defining these numbers that you're asking for. All right, we only got a few minutes. I think this is the last slide. So this just brings it back full circle. One of the first recommendations or considerations that I told you to look into was the number of code bases, the number of databases, unified versus integrated. There's a really, really strong relationship between retention and number of code bases, and it's not a coincidence, right? So what I did was I took a significantly statistically significant sample set, I think between 30 and 40 companies, and looked at what their revenue retention numbers were relative to the number of code bases they had in their solution. As you can see, companies that have a single code base tend to keep more customers year in and year out. As they get more complex behind the scenes, as they have more code bases, as that system becomes more Frankenstein behind the scenes and integrated, their retention goes down, right? And that's not a coincidence, right? So again, that brings it full circle. I've left very little time for questions, and I apologize for that. But let's see if we have time for one or two questions.
Okay, all right, we do have a few. Okay, so first one, this is a really good one. During the implementation process, what is the best way to get a full list of services they offer rather than them respond with "what do you want"? I have found they haven't been forthcoming with information, and then it's hard to ask the right questions.
That is a great question, and we could spend probably half hour talking about that, because it gets to the heart of a lot of what I talked about. So that, to me, if they're being vague, if they're being a little squirrely in terms of transparency and what they offer, that's a caution flag for me. And I don't know who it was that they talked to, but and it could be that the company has a set menu, and maybe that sales executive is just not being forthright. But that's a bit of a red flag for me. An approach I would take: ask what they get for free, like what is the base, and then start asking questions like, okay, built into this base, which is why it's always important to ask for a formal plan. Like, what does this plan look like? What is the implementation timeline? What are the milestones? What is your responsibility? What's my responsibility? And then start digging deeper into questions like, okay, well, I see you've estimated 40 hours of advisory time or consulting time, in this area, to whatever, there's a bunch of checklists that you have to go through in terms of mapping over your old database to your new. What if that takes more than 40 hours? What does that look like? Like, are we on our own? Like, do you have to start asking tough questions like that? And then I'm guessing, as I said, most of the companies that I will put customers in touch with are open, honest, transparent, and so that doesn't come up a lot.
Right.
But so start asking some quantifiable questions, like, okay, well, what happens if those hours run out? Like, do we have to pay for more hours, or are there no more hours to pay for? Are we just on our own? So once you start asking tougher questions like that, that's when they might try to upsell you and reveal the pricing, right? They might say,
Yeah.
oh, well, if that happens, you're really better off in this track, in this module, in this path, and that costs X, that costs Y. And so it's unfortunate that customers have to jump through hoops sometimes to try to get that pricing, but that would be one way to do it, is just to try to drill down on what happens if. That would be the best approach, I think.
Got it. Thanks. Okay, we'll try one more question before we wrap up. What argument, Patrick, would you make to an executive leadership team to show that your company isn't utilizing a system to its full potential, and basically a case for why your company should invest further?
Yeah, I would say call me, because I can walk you through a presentation that I just did, because this is a big part. So we have 1 minute. Okay, so let me give you a framework, and it comes down to kind of soft dollars, hard dollars, right? And so sometimes it's like, for example, consolidation of systems, right? And so you might be paying $10 per employee per month for some widget within talent management, for example, right? But if you go to a unified system, that talent management might be included in that, and it might be a $4 add-on, for example. So that's an immediate savings of $6 per employee per month that you could put in front of a CEO. That's quantifiable, right? So there's a consolidation element of that. Sometimes it's soft dollars, meaning indirect, like, hey, it's going to save the HR team 10 hours a week, right? And the CFO might say, well, you're here, you're salaried, like, what do I care, right? And that's, you tell them, well, we can work on more strategic things, right? And show them, and this is, as I said, this is worth a webinar in and of itself. And I'm happy to have this conversation because I feel strongly about it. And it's something I work with customers a lot. So what it takes is, okay, this is how much time we're spending today. Like, with the system, we're estimating that our team will spend, whatever that Y is, right? Whatever that delta is, right? Because some of that is going to be automated and or pushed back to self-service, right? So the front line. So instead of Bob or Betty on the front lines calling HR with this question every time, they could do it themselves. So the long story short, it's going to save our team time. And then we can focus on things like employee engagement. And then you put studies in front of them, and we do studies ourselves on this to say, okay, higher employee engagement translates to, fewer incidents, safety incidents, fewer customer incidents. If you work in healthcare, higher profitability. Like, there's study after study after study showing higher customer engagement. So that's more of an indirect one. Compliance is another one. That's a tougher one to quantify, but the problem can be catastrophic if you get sued, if you fines, companies go out of business if they're found not be compliant. So compliance is another element. That's a really, really great question. I wish we had more time to talk about that, but definitely reach out. I think I have my contact information there. Jot down my email, send me an email. I'm happy to talk about that. We don't have enough time in the last couple of minutes to cover that in what it's worth, but great question.
I thought so too, Patrick. Thank you so much for giving that a try. And honestly, I think we'd benefit from you delivering that webinar, that topic about.
We'll do that one next time. That's one I recently developed that one because it's something I do a lot. As I said, it's not something that we kind of hang our shingle out to help people, find a solution that works for them, but an indirect need of that is justifying that internally. Yeah. So I thought that was a worthwhile topic. So now it's a really, really great question.
Great question. Okay, we'll quickly wrap up since we're over time. Thank you again, Patrick, for such a great presentation. Just a reminder to HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRB credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. While you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, virtual conferences, premium membership, and more. I'd like to say one more thank you to Patrick, our presenter for today, and to all the good people at PayPro. I'd also like to thank you, our webcast viewer. Thanks for spending an hour with us, and we will see you next time.